Advance to the next level of portable gaming with the Game Boy Advance. 8-bit joystick. When the Game Boy Advance released in 2001, it was 12 long years after the original Game Boy. Both systems dominated portable gaming around the world before the rise of mobile phone gaming. The Game Boy Advance was the last major video game system to have classic 2D pixel graphics as the dominant graphics format. Some thought that the Game Boy Advance was just for kids, but there were also some incredible titles that built upon decades of excellent 2D games on Nintendo systems. It has been over 2 decades since the Game Boy Advance hit the market. There was 1,538 games released for the Game Boy Advance worldwide, and I had a hard time chopping my list of essential Game Boy Advance games down to just 20 games, but these are the ones that I would recommend that you start with. Buckle up, there are a lot of Game Boy Advance games to cover, but before that, I make videos like this each week, so make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss a single one. Next week, I'm going to go over essential GameCube games. Now, on to the games. Metroid Zero Mission is an expanded remaster remake of the original Metroid game, but with much improved visuals, improved animation, and Super Metroid-inspired gameplay. It has new maps, new items, new areas, and new mini-bosses. There are some who consider it the best Metroid game on any platform, and they would have a good case for it. It tells the origins of legendary Nintendo space bounty hunter Samus Aran exploring the labyrinth depths of planet Zebes. It is a timeless Nintendo adventure brimming with action and immersive alien world exploration. It feels both new and nostalgic at the same time. Sadly, it came out in 2004 and there are not many copies in circulation, and the price of this game has been going up quite a bit as of late. But who could have guessed that a Metroid game could be one of the best Metroidvania games on any platform? Nintendo fans, that's who. Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. Studio Flagship was a collaboration between Nintendo, Capcom, and Sega, and after putting together the twin Legend of Zelda games, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages on the Game Boy Color, they set out to make Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap for Game Boy Advance. The Minish Cap is a name for the magical hat that lives on top of Link's head and will talk to him to help guide you through the adventure. The Minish are a tiny race of little fairy folk, and Link has to shrink down to their tiny size to negotiate puzzles and dungeons in this incredibly well-made 2D Legend of Zelda adventure. Puzzles have to be solved by manipulating objects both as large and tiny sizes, and then your change of perspective on things allows for intricate dungeon puzzles and tiny terrors in Link's trials and tribulations. This game also includes a number of new power-ups and tools. In classic Legend of Zelda style, the new tools are essential to solve the puzzles of the dungeons to progress the game. The Minish Cap is 2D Legend of Zelda at its best. It is glorious, a feast for the eyes, and a joy to play. Mother 3. Being a Nintendo fan over the years is an exercise in both pleasure and pain. There is the incredible pleasure that one has playing the Mother trilogy of games, and then the incredible sadness that one of the greatest RPGs ever made has never been officially translated into English and released outside of Japan. Mother 3 is the creative follow-up to Earthbound, aka Mother 2, and the original Mother, which is now known as Earthbound Zero. The first game was on the Nintendo Famicom, and it was never released outside of Japan until an official translation was brought to the Wii U much later. The second Mother game was brought to the West as Earthbound and is the poster child of a cult hit. The development of Mother 3 first targeted the Nintendo 64 and then the N64 DD disk drive expansion, and then the project finally moved to the Game Boy Advance and was finally released in 2006. Like the other games, Mother 3 is a top-down, turn-based role-playing game, but stars psychic children in a surreal, sarcastic, and heartwarming journey that is beloved by millions of gamers all over the world. Beneath the surface of the childlike charm lies a complex narrative grappling with loss, resilience, and the darkness lurking within our hearts. Get ready for emotional gut punches next to laugh-out-loud humor. For whatever reason, Nintendo has never officially translated Mother 3 and released it outside of Japan, but there is an incredibly accurate and beloved fan translation that you can enjoy on original hardware by using an EverDrive, or just get one of the many unofficial cartridges. So this must be a little bit what it feels like to be a European gamer when there were a ton of the best Super Nintendo games that were never officially released in your region. Regardless about how you go about playing Mother 3, it is absolutely essential. It is gut-wrenching and heartbreaking both due to the plot and the fact that we never officially got to play this masterpiece. Metroid Fusion. When it was released in 2002, Metroid Fusion was the first 2D Metroid game since Super Metroid in 1994, and it featured our hero Samus Aran in her new fusion suit, which was infected by the X-Parasite. She must navigate the interconnected corridors on an abandoned research station while she is hunted by her doppelganger, the SAX. Metroid Fusion streamlines the series' exploration elements while amplifying the creepy atmosphere. It delivers a pulse-pounding blend of action platforming, exploration, strategic power-ups, and boss battles against grotesque X-mutations. Though it is an amazing game in its own right, it didn't do a ton to distinguish itself from the other Metroid games, and felt much more linear than its expansive predecessors. But it remains an excellent 2D entry, and the linearity arguably suits a handheld Metroid game much better than a home console game. This game inspired Metroid Dread on the Nintendo Switch, and any two-dimensional Metroid game made by Nintendo is a glorious thing to behold. The Game Boy Advance was graced with not just one, but two amazing 2D Metroid games. Check them out. WarioWare Inc. Mega Microgame. WarioWare Inc. Mega Microgames is the first in a new Nintendo game series where you are thrust into a random selection of microgames and you have a mere amount of seconds to figure out just what the heck is going on and how you have to solve it. These are wacky, fun, creative, and some of the best Nintendo insanity in years. It really has a Kansai Kyoto Japanese comedic aesthetic to it. It's like someone is changing the channel on the video game and you have under 5 seconds to figure out just what the heck is going on and how to do it. Nintendo introduces a bunch of new wacky characters that would go on to bring smiles to faces in this and later versions of the game. This game throws a series of random challenges at you, and as you master them and get through it, it gives you a steady stream of dopamine. This is wacky Nintendo brilliance at its best, and is an absolute must-have and must-play. Mario Kart Super Circuit. Ever since the original Mario Kart for Super Nintendo, there have been some absolutely excellent Mario Kart games on every Nintendo platform since then that were powerful enough to run it. Sorry, Virtua Boy and Game Boy Color. With Mario Kart Super Circuit, Nintendo evolved what was already working on the original game and Mario Kart 64 to make an incredibly tight, well-done kart racing masterpiece on the Game Boy Advance, which ran flawlessly and had a ton of fun when you network with your friends. There is a high degree of polish, and this portable powerhouse has a staggering 40 tracks. the most of any Mario Kart game at the time, and has 8 Mario characters, each with their own kart and driving style. This is the game series that was so good that it spawned an entire genre of kart racing games, and every once in a while Nintendo likes to show other developers what they can do and why they set the baseline. Mario Kart Super Circuit is absolutely essential and a timeless masterpiece for Game Boy Advance players. Everyone needs to have a copy of this game. Advance Wars. When Advance Wars was released in 2001, Game Boy Advance fans fell in love with its well-done, creative, turn-based, cartoon, grid-based strategy game and thought it was a new series. Little did they know that the series started off as Famicom Wars, Super Famicom Wars, and Game Boy Wars, but wasn't officially released outside of Japan until this game. I still think that it's a little hard to believe that Nintendo would publish this awesome game series developed by their second-party developers, Intelligent Systems, and then not release it in the biggest game markets around the world. You play a commander in the cartoon Orange Star Army as you face off in a series of missions by moving your troops, capturing cities, and building and repairing units. There are also special commander power-ups and linked multiplayer. It is surprisingly well done and has really thought-provoking cerebral challenges. The 2 Advance Wars games were recently remade for the Nintendo Switch, but the original 2D graphics are charming and timeless. Advance Wars is a blast, pun fully intended. Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Pokémon was still going strong when the Game Boy Advance was released, and it was so popular that it influenced the design of the Game Boy Advance, at least for the plan to have an extended battery life and a link cable for networking and trading. The 3rd generation of Pokémon kicked off with Ruby and Sapphire, and included 200 Pokémon in the new sun-soaked Hoenn region. In this game, your Trainer Kid character will face off against the villainous teams Magma and Aqua, and explore bustling cities, volcano, and underwater depths. Pokémon Emerald is the upgraded version of Ruby and Sapphire and was more evolution than revolution, and updated the locations where you could nab certain Pokémon, and allowed you to catch a greater pool of Pokémon than its predecessors, and added the Battle Frontier competition island you can visit after beating the Elite Four to earn badges, buy items, and get new moves to teach your Pokémons. The widescreen graphics of the Game Boy Advance improves the look of the battle screens, and the entire Hoenn region looked incredibly lush compared to the 8-bit Kanto and Johto regions of the previous generations of Pokémon games. Fire Emblem. With the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo finally got around to releasing some of their strategy game genres that they've had in Japan for years, and finally showed them off to the West. Fire Emblem is a tactical fantasy role-playing game series that goes back to the Nintendo Famicom and Super Famicom, but we didn't get those games. The Fire Emblem series is known for grid-based fantasy battles, a complex story with character bonds, and the heart-pounding tension of a potential permadeath of your characters. There are 3 heroes, each with their own unique narratives and strategy, and you command an army of archers, mages, and knights and fight against dungeons filled with bad guys. It is important to strategically position your units next to each other to take advantage of their bonds to release powerful combination attacks. Fire Emblem. It's more than just the fighters and figures in Smash Bros. Melee. Gunstar Superheroes. A lot of people have no idea that Treasure actually made a sequel to the Sega Genesis classic Gunstar Heroes, and released it on the Game Boy Advance called Gunstar Superheroes. It is a vibrant action, two-dimensional, cartoon violent romp with the same frantic run-and-gun gameplay, but with customizable weapon systems. There are crazy, over-the-top futuristic landscapes, alien planets, and shoot-'em-up inspired levels. Unlike the original game, the difficulty is well balanced, and there is an easy mode mockery which changes the story and the dialogue depending on the difficulty setting. This game is over the top and insane, and most people have no idea that it exists. It is a perfect example of truly amazing 2D games being made for the Game Boy Advance that are just ready to be discovered and enjoyed. Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland is an expanded remake of the NES game Kirby's Adventure, but with updated graphics and redesigned remixed levels. You guide the ever-cute pink flapping Kirby on his hero journey through Dreamland. You fight evil King DDD by swallowing enemies whole and eating them, or taking their powers by turning into power-upped versions of Kirby based on the kinds of enemies that you consume, such as fireballs and swords. This version has really great controls, really charming visuals, and there are a ton of hidden collectibles. It can seem a little basic at times, but it is an expanded reimagining of one of the most beloved Kirby games, but in a portable handheld form factor that is easy to pick up and put a smile on your face. Sonic Advance. Sonic Advance was a really good classic Sonic the Hedgehog game which was designed from beginning to end for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance. For many die-hard Sega fans, this was blasphemy, but it was created only around a year after Sega decided to throw in the towel on making their own game systems and develop games for popular game systems on the market, and that included Nintendo. So it is a little mind-blowing that this is one of the first original Sonic the Hedgehog games made specifically for a Nintendo platform, and it is so good. Sonic Advance brings the fast running and jumping of classic Sonic the Hedgehog games through 7 vibrant zones and classic Sonic elements such as hidden springs and loop-de-loops. There are 4 playable characters: Sonic, Tails, Amy, and Knuckles, each with their own unique playstyle and abilities. Sonic can have fast lightning bursts, Knuckles can climb walls, and Amy can smash obstacles with hammers, and Tails can soar in the air using his tail. There are also Chow Gardens where you can raise digital pets. Sonic Team nailed the core about what is good about classic 2D Sonic the Hedgehog games and put together one of the best 2D Sonic games. Sadly, Sega would forget to do this for a very long time, but Sonic Advance is a really good classic Sonic the Hedgehog, but on the Game Boy Advance. They would follow this up with Sonic Advance 2 and Sonic Advance 3, and those are excellent games. What a world we live in. Gotta go fast on Game Boy Advance. Castlevania: Circle of the Moon. Castlevania: Circle of the Moon was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance, and it was an excellent Castlevania game being made after Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation 1. This was back when Konami was interested in making 2D Metroidvania Castlevania games and put some of their best people on it. However, you get the feeling that Konami didn't have the final Game Boy Advance hardware when they were designing the game, and one common complaint is that the characters are a little hard to see on the non-backlit hardware. Konami would later go on to make follow-up games on the Game Boy Advance that would have their characters with a bit of a bright outline to contrast them against the darker backgrounds. You play as Nathan Graves, a whip-wielding student trying to defeat monsters in Castlevania, Dracula's haunted castle, trying to prevent the recently resurrected vampire lord from achieving his full strength. They would go on to make some very good Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. It almost goes without saying that the music is incredibly well done, but the bar has been raised pretty high for the Castlevania series. It is a very entertaining game, and you can play it on modern systems as a part of the Castlevania Advance collection, but it feels really good on Game Boy Advance hardware. I would just opt for playing it on the Game Boy Micro or Game Boy Advance SP for that backlit Castlevania goodness. Konami Krazy Racers. Konami beat Nintendo to the punch on making a Mario Kart style game on Nintendo's new system, the Game Boy Advance. Konami Krazy Racers is a trip. Instead of starring Mario and pals, there are Raiden from Metal Gear Solid, Dracula from Castlevania, and Goemon from The Mystical Ninja, driving cars around, picking up power-ups, and blasting each other. This is a love letter to 8-bit and 16-bit era Konami, and the tracks are all based on beloved Konami games of the era. The music is really good, and the sound effects put a smile on my face. The gameplay is tight and fun, and it's one of the best kart racing games ever made. If you like Mario Kart, then you really deserve it to get yourself a copy of Konami Krazy Racers for the Game Boy Advance. It's a trip. WarioWare Twisted. WarioWare Twisted is Nintendo at their best. It is a follow-up to WarioWare Microgames, but instead of just controlling it with your D-pad on the Game Boy Advance, they put a gyroscopic sensor in a uniquely shaped Game Boy Advance cartridge. When you start the game, it calibrates based on the starting position, and then you play through 200 microgames by spinning and twisting the Game Boy Advance system itself. By the way, this game cannot be emulated, and you can't play it on the Game Boy Player for GameCube. The only way to enjoy it is to have a physical cartridge in a real system. The cost of this game has really gone up in recent years. However, the Japanese version, Mawaru Made in Wario, is extremely affordable, and I would definitely suggest that you get a copy if you're placing an order of imported games from Japan. There's also not really a language barrier using the Japanese version because of the quick and prompt nature of the game. This game is hilarious and involves all the wacky characters of previous WarioWare games. By the way, this game was never released in Europe in any form, so my viewers in Europe, you really deserve it to yourself to import a copy of this. WarioWare Twisted was in development before Nintendo released the Nintendo Wii system, so it might have inspired their experimentations in motion control gameplay methods. WarioWare Twisted is essential Nintendo wackiness. This is a Kansai humor and creativity that I crave. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was a distant sequel/soft reboot of the groundbreaking PlayStation strategy game Final Fantasy Tactics, and it had the similar gameplay and is set in the fantasy land of Ivalice, but it seems to be 100 years later after the wars of Final Fantasy Tactics. One of the very amusing things about this game that they did differently is that our heroes are actually a group of children who are drawn into a captivating fantasy book. As they read about past magical battles and fantastic creatures, and then they journey there through the power of imagination. You assemble a clan of your classmates with customizable jobs and abilities, and lead them through intense grid-based battles with magical creatures in strategic battles. This lovely story is layered with many different levels of context and blurs the line between fantasy and reality, and includes themes of betrayal, friendship, and growing up. The artwork is lush and charming, and there are some of the best hand-drawn 2D sprite works that I've seen on any game platform. It is a true shame that Final Fantasy Tactics Advance hasn't been released on other systems, but it is a charming, enduring, strategic tactical role-playing game which is unlike any other. Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town. Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town is the very epitome of coziness. You play a young person who has been notified that they inherited a farm in the countryside, and then you move to the farm and clear brush, grow some crops, raise some animals, talk to the many farm folks, and establish relationships with them. You can eventually date and marry some of them, build a family, and then watch your farm grow as the seasons change. There are mysterious events, festivals, and the pressure of a rival farmer adding a little financial stress. But this game is the fantasy of the joy of living simply and crafts a heartwarming relationships while growing crops and nurturing your farm. You might notice that this sounds a lot like Stardew Valley, and that is because the Harvest Moon series predates it by several decades, and Stardew Valley was heavily inspired by it. Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town, is one of the better updated iterations of the Harvest Moon series, and it is the coziest farming game that you're going to see on the Game Boy Advance. There also was a pretty cozy sequel for it, also on the Game Boy Advance. So, if you're into Stardew Valley, you really owe it to yourself to play through one of the Harvest Moon games that inspired it, and this is an excellent option to do just that. Golden Sun. There are some excellent role-playing games that I was going to put on this list, but they are mostly ports of existing Super Famicom or PlayStation games. But I wanted to give some of the original games on Game Boy Advance some credit, and that includes Golden Sun. It was released in 2001 near the launch of the Game Boy Advance, and it follows a group of young psychic kids in a fantasy world where you embark on a quest to prevent the return of destructive alchemy. Over the journey, you forge bonds with your companions and face a choice of embracing harmony or unleashing devastation upon the world. Golden Sun treads upon some well-walked paths by previous role-playing games, but it does introduce some unique play mechanics and has some likable characters, good settings, and a unique story. It's also a heck of a lot more fun after you get through the first couple hours, which are a bit of a slog. But Golden Sun is a well-made, fun Japanese role-playing game that many gamers have passed up. But if you're going to get into Game Boy Advance games, then I heavily recommend that you check it out. Mario & Luigi Superstar. Mario & Luigi Superstar built upon the previous Super Mario role-playing games, but told a unique role-playing game story using Mario and Luigi as they team up with Bowser to journey to the magical Bean Kingdom to fight an evil ruler who has stolen Princess Peach's voice through magical shenanigans. It has quirky enemies, charming graphics, funny, well-written dialogue, and it is a delightful romp through Super Mario RPG goodness. Mario and Luigi are controlled simultaneously, and you can combine them for unique combination attacks. There are a ton of side quests and minigames, but Mario and Luigi's amusing animations and antics play into the game's heartwarming sense of humor. It is a cozy role-playing game chuckle with the beloved plumbing Mario Brothers. You know, don't you think Luigi gets a little annoyed when people refer to them as the Mario Brothers? Because, you know, he gets passed up a little bit. It's not the year of Luigi anymore. But definitely check out Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. F-Zero Maximum Velocity. F-Zero Maximum Velocity was a launch title that showed off what the Game Boy Advance could do graphically by bringing the futuristic racing challenge of F-Zero to a portable system. Believe it or not, the high frame rate scaling of sprites was still pretty impressive in 2001 on a mobile device, especially when the equivalent cell phones were playing Snake. It is a sequel to the original F-Zero, which had you race an anti-gravity hovercraft around a sci-fi futuristic track, featuring a number of treacherous courses, colorful cartoon characters, breakneck speeds, harrowing hairpin turns, and gravity-defying jumps. The earlier tracks are not too hard, and it is a real pick-up-and-play experience, but the difficulty ratchets up quickly for seasoned F-Zero veterans. F-Zero Maximum Velocity was one of the first Game Boy Advance games, and it is still one of the best. Game Boy Advance hardware. Since the Game Boy was without effective competition for almost an entire decade, sorry Sega Game Gear, Atari Lynx, SNK Neo Geo Pocket, and Game.com. The Game Boy had its lifespan expanded by the Pokémon craze, so Nintendo took some time to develop an official follow-up. The Game Boy Color was more of a mid-cycle revision upgrade than a full Game Boy successor. In 1996, various magazines were talking about Nintendo's Project Atlantis as a follow-up to the Game Boy, but it was ultimately cancelled in favor of the Advanced Game Boy project that became the Game Boy Advance. By the way, the name Xbox was also a project codename that stuck around and became an official product name. The Game Boy Advance AGB-001 was released March in 2001 in Japan and around the world in June of 2001. It actually has two CPUs, one for Game Boy Advance software and one for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Running the new Advance software is a new 16.8 MHz 32-bit ARM CPU with embedded memory that delivers a lot more punch while still being power efficient. Also included was a Sharp LR35902 Z80 and 808 derived CPU running at 3.8 or 4.1 MHz for Game Boy Color and Game Boy backwards compatibility. It was supplied juice by two AA batteries that provided about 15 hours of gameplay on average while playing Game Boy Advance. The screen was a 2.9 reflective film transistor TFT liquid crystal display LCD, but it was not backlit. It was notorious for requiring a light to be positioned just right to get the most out of it, and it created a small industry of various clip-on lights. It had a resolution of 240 by 160 pixels with a 3:2 aspect ratio, and it had 15-bit RGB color support and was capable of displaying 512 simultaneous colors in character mode and 32,000 simultaneous colors in bitmap mode. Nintendo followed up with the Game Boy Advance SP on February 14, 2003. It had a fold-up, compact clamshell design, and the original AGS-001 Game Boy Advance SP had a front-lit screen, but the front light can be turned on or off. Later on, there was the Game Boy SP AGS-101 with a backlit screen with the ability to change the brightness of the backlight. The Game Boy Advance SP had a rechargeable battery that was easily user replaceable. Every Nintendo handheld system since the release of the Game Boy Advance SP has included a screen with a built-in light and a rechargeable battery. It delivered battery life of 10 hours with continuous play with the light on and 18 hours with the light off, and it needed at most 3 hours of recharging. Nintendo removed the TRS headphone jack from the SP, but you could hook up a headphone adapter for the Game Boy Advance SP on the networking port. Game Boy Player for Nintendo GameCube. The Game Boy Player for Nintendo GameCube was a hardware add-on that enabled it to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance cartridges on a TV. Game Boy Micro. In 2005, Nintendo released the diminutive Game Boy Micro that can be tucked into the palm of your hand, yet can play Game Boy Advance games, but not original Game Boy games. It features a rechargeable battery and actually has a headphone jack and a premium metal build. The screen is just 2 inches, but it is a brilliant backlit IPS display that is gorgeous on the eyes. It is a bit of an acquired taste, but it's not without its fans. Nintendo DS. In 2004, Nintendo released its dual-screen system, the Nintendo DS, but they claimed it was not going to replace the Game Boy Advance line, but it eventually did. It also featured a Game Boy Advance slot and could play Game Boy Advance cartridges natively, either on the top or bottom DS screen, but not full screen, but with native centered integer resolution to avoid the blurring of pixels. And in 2006, they released the Nintendo DS Lite with an improved bright screen and redesign and refined form factor. Then later, the DSi, the DSi XL, the 3DS, the 2DS, the 3DS XL, and the new 3DS did not have a Game Boy Advance cartridge port and could not play them. As of June 30th, 2009, the Game Boy Advance series had sold 81.48 million units worldwide, of which 43.52 million are Game Boy Advance SP units. It is a little strange to think of a game system that was released in 2001 as a retro system, but that was over 2 decades ago. It really was the last hurrah of 2D games before indie games brought it back. There are literally over 1,500 Game Boy Advance games, and it would take you a very long time to explore them. Next week, I'm going to cover essential GameCube games, and I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to this channel so you don't miss it. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome, play retro.